The wind always found me before the light did. It slipped under the door, rattled the loose panes, carried the taste of dust across my tongue before I even opened my eyes. That was how morning started at Cold Mesa. Never with birdsong or laughter, just the low hum of the land reminding me it was still here, and so was I. Sometimes I wondered if the two of us were just waiting each other out. I'd sit up slow, joints crackling, that old ache in my side reminding me of places I'd rather forget. My knees didn't like the mornings much anymore, and my back wasn't far behind. I'd reach for my shirt draped across the chair, canvas thin and worn soft as skin, and pull it on before sliding into my boots. Always the boots next. A man could be caught without his pride, without his rifle, without even a warm bed, but not without his boots. The cabin was little more than 4 walls and a roof patched with stubbornness. A bed, a table, a stove that groaned as much as I did, and 2 chairs. One broken, the other where I ate alone every night. There was a lantern on the shelf, though most nights I'd let the fire do the talking. The silence was easier in the dark. I'd light the stove, fill the kettle, and sip water from the tin cup to wash away the bitter taste of sleep. I must have been 45, maybe older, though I'd stopped counting. The war had stolen my youth, the fire had taken my wife, and the land had stripped me bare of everything else. I didn't ask for much back, I just lived. Quiet, day by day, the way a man does when asking for more feels greedy. I had a handful of cattle left, too stubborn to die off yet. A few chickens, though the coyotes kept me on edge, and an old mare who clung to life like she had something left to prove. That was my company most days. No neighbors came by, and I wasn't much for town. Folks there had a way of looking at a man who'd lost too much, like sorrow might rub off if they stood too close. Some nights, I'd sit on the porch with the fire low inside and watch the mesa stretch out flat and empty, red cliffs carving the horizon like scars. The quiet wasn't peace, it was weight, heavy as the memory of her face the night the fire swallowed the house, heavy as the cries of men I couldn't save during the war. You carry those things until they dig grooves into your bones, and after a while, you forget what it feels like not to. I wasn't bitter, though, not in the way folks might think. Life had done its taking, and I'd stopped shaking my fist at the sky long ago. A man doesn't bargain with the wind, you endure it. That was my creed. Still, I won't lie, I felt hollow most mornings. I'd wake, work the ranch, patch a fence, haul water, cook stew, eat it alone, and lie back down, only to do it again. Sometimes I thought of her, the way her laugh used to cut through the quiet. Sometimes I thought of the war, the mud, the smoke, the endless sound of men breaking apart, and sometimes I thought of nothing at all, which was the hardest thing to carry because nothing leaves a bigger hole than silence. That was who I was before it happened, before the barn door creaked open one cold morning, and I found more than I'd ever expected waiting in the hay. But I'll get to that in time. For now, all you need to know is that I was alone. Not the kind of alone that makes a man hungry for company, but the kind that convinces him he doesn't need it anymore. That was me, Flint McAllen, a rancher worn thin by years, a man who thought the world had already given and taken all it was going to. Funny how the land teaches you lessons you didn't ask for. The mesa kept whispering, even when I ignored it, "You're not finished yet." I didn't believe it, not until the day I opened that barn door. Before I take you further into this story, I want to pause here and ask you something. If you've walked with me this far, if you've felt that silence pressing in on you the way it pressed on me out there in Cold Mesa, then stay a little longer. There's more to tell. And if you're listening, I'd ask you kindly to like this video, share a comment about where you're watching from, and subscribe to this channel. It helps keep these stories alive, stories about people who've lost, who've endured, and who found something worth holding on to again. Because what happened next wasn't just a turning point in my life, it was proof that even in a place stripped down to silence, something unexpected can walk right through your door and remind you what it means to belong. And I'll tell you this much, it started with the wind, always the wind. The morning it happened, I remember the air felt different, the kind of stillness that doesn't belong on the mesa. The wind had quieted, and instead of the usual hum through the cracks of my cabin, there was only silence. That silence had weight, heavy enough to make me pause before stepping out the door. My breath clouded faint in the chill, boots pressing into dirt that had turned brittle from the too many dry weeks. That's when I saw it, the barn door, not wide, just cracked open, rocking on its hinge with the gentlest touch of the air. I hadn't left it like that. I stopped on the porch, eyes narrowing. My hand hovered near the shotgun inside, but I didn't take it. I've lived long enough to know rushing toward a thing only makes it worse. Men die that way, charging shadows that were never threats in the first place. No, I waited. Let my stomach tighten, let my senses sharpen. Then I stepped off the porch, slow, steady, boots scraping against the dry earth. The air smelled of dust and wood, same as always, but beneath it was something faint, human, almost hidden. When I reached the barn, I pressed my palm against the rough wood, the grain cold against my skin. I eased the door open, just enough for the light to stretch inside. That's when my breath caught. There in the straw lay 5 figures. Women, barefoot, their dresses torn, bruises painting their skin like cruel reminders of whoever had touched them last. Apache, I could tell by the line of their faces, the beadwork still clinging to their tattered clothes, the pride in their bones even under all that weight. They didn't scramble or cry out, they didn't beg. They just looked up at me, silent, watchful, clinging together as if moving apart would mean losing whatever strength they had left. The oldest sat in the middle, legs folded beneath her, arms wrapped around the others like she'd been keeping them stitched together by will alone. Her lip was cracked, one side of her face swollen, but her eyes, they met mine without flinching, strong, direct, like a hawk pinning me in place. For a moment, I forgot to breathe. I'd seen hurt before, on the battlefield when men bled into the dirt, in my wife's face the night the fire tore through everything we owned. But this was the kind of hurt that lingers after the worst has already passed, the kind of pain that doesn't scream anymore because it's learned nobody comes when it does. I didn't speak, didn't ask where they came from or who had done this to them. Questions like that didn't matter, not yet. One of the younger girls stirred, pulling a thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. Another pressed her face into the eldest woman's side, hiding. The youngest, no more than a child, had a doll made of scraps of cloth clutched in her little hands. My chest tightened. They didn't move to rise, didn't reach for me, just sat there, waiting, maybe bracing, as if they'd been cast out too many times to expect anything else. I stepped back, my boots crunching against the dirt. My throat worked, but no words came. It hit me all at once. The truth of it. They had nowhere else. They had come in the night, carrying bruises in silence, and landed here of all places, at my barn door. And the choice of what to do with that wasn't theirs. It was mine. For years I'd lived by myself, convincing myself solitude was safer, that no one could be taken from me if I never let anyone close again. But standing there, looking at them, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, a weight in my gut that wasn't fear, but responsibility. I let the barn door close and walked back to the cabin. My hands were trembling, though I told myself it was from the cold. Inside, I sliced bread, opened a jar of beans, set dried meat and apples on a tray. I filled the kettle, laid an old blanket across my arm. My hand brushed against the shotgun leaning by the door, but I left it where it was. Whatever this was, I didn't feel danger in it. Not the kind of danger that comes with malice. This was a quieter thing, fragile. When I returned, I didn't push the door wide, just opened it enough to slide the tray and blanket inside. I didn't speak, didn't linger. The eldest woman's eyes followed me the whole time, sharp but unreadable. I set the food down on a crate, placed the blanket beside it, and stepped back into the cold. Closing that door behind me, I stood still in the yard, staring at nothing. They were strangers. I owed them nothing. A man could have told himself that and walked away. But something deep inside me said leaving them out there, even for a night, wasn't an option. Not for me. Not anymore. The next morning, the food was gone. The blanket, too. The barn door had been latched from the inside. That was all the answer I needed. I went about my day the way I always did, fixing fences, hauling water, feeding the chickens, but my eyes kept drifting to that barn. The silence wasn't the same anymore. It wasn't just mine. There were 5 more lives folded into it now, and I couldn't pretend otherwise. That was the morning my solitude cracked. Not loud, not all at once, but like the first break in ice before the thaw. The days that followed fell into a rhythm I never expected. I'd been alone long enough that silence was as natural to me as breathing, but now there was a new kind of silence living out in the barn. It wasn't empty like mine had been. It was watchful, waiting, the sort of quiet that comes from people who've learned too well that asking for help only makes it vanish quicker. That first night, after I left food and a blanket, I lay in bed with my eyes fixed on the ceiling. The wind moaned against the cabin walls, the fire settled low, and still I listened for any sound from outside. Nothing came. I told myself it didn't matter, that I'd done what I could, but my chest felt tight like I'd left something unfinished. By morning the food was gone, the blanket too, and I noticed the latch pulled from the inside. They had claimed the barn as theirs for the night. That was enough. I worked that day as I always did, mending fence posts, checking the trough, patching the roof seam with tar, but my eyes kept drifting toward the barn. Each time I told myself to stop, that they weren't my responsibility. But the thought pressed in all the same. If they had nowhere else, then this land was all they had left. That evening, I set a small pot of stew on the porch, enough for several mouths, though I didn't say it out loud, not even to myself. I walked back inside, sat by the stove, and waited. Hours later, when I opened the door again, the pot was gone. No sound, no words, just the scrape of wind across the mesa and the faint tracks of bare feet in the dust. The same thing happened the next day and the next. By the 3rd morning, something had changed. Near the chicken coop, I found a small bundle of wild herbs, neatly wrapped in cloth, left on top of a bucket. Someone had gone out and gathered them with care. Later, I noticed the water trough had been scrubbed clean, the kind of clean my hands hadn't managed in years. That evening, the coop was already fed before I got there. I stood with my hand on the gate, looking at the neat scatters of grain, the hens pecking with calm. It wasn't the work of accident, it was them. They were helping, quietly, without being asked, without thanks, without words. I felt something stir in me then, something I hadn't felt in years. Not joy exactly, but a small easing of the weight I'd been carrying, as if the ranch itself had sighed with relief. On the 4th morning, I saw her, the eldest. She was standing outside the barn, arms crossed over her chest, her face unreadable. I stopped mid-step, not sure if I should speak first. She didn't wait long. Her voice was rough but steady. "You going to run us off?" I shook my head. "No." "Why not?" I opened my mouth, but no good answer came. I wasn't sure myself. Maybe because I was tired of shutting doors. Maybe because, for the first time in years, someone else was on this land and it didn't feel wrong. I shrugged. "Don't see a reason to." She studied me a moment longer, then gave the smallest nod and stepped back into the barn. That was the end of it. No thank you, no explanation, but somehow it felt like a beginning. By the end of that week, they started showing themselves in pieces. The youngest, no more than a girl, came to sit near the coop one afternoon, stitching dolls out of fabric scraps she must have found in the barn. She never spoke, but sometimes she hummed, soft and tuneless, the sound carrying just enough to remind me she was there. Another woman, thin but quick, fixed the coop latch with a bit of twine and a nail. A third swept the barn floor with a broom she must have fashioned from straw and a stick. Each of them moved with purpose, each of them carrying more silence than most men could bear. They didn't hover near me, didn't ask for permission, didn't wait for orders. They simply began, as if their hands couldn't sit still, even in safety. I noticed things I hadn't before. A blanket folded neatly on the porch rail after I'd left a shawl there for the girl. A water bucket filled and waiting when I went to haul it myself. The fire already stirred in the stove some mornings, kindling set in careful stacks by the door. They weren't visitors, They weren't beggars, they were survivors, same as me. And in the quiet exchange of food for herbs, blankets for mended latches, stew for scrubbed troughs, something unspoken was passing between us, a kind of trust that didn't need words to exist. One evening, just before the sun fell behind the cliffs, I heard footsteps on the porch, soft, hesitant. When I opened the door, they were there, 5 of them standing in a line. Faces cleaner now, shoulders straighter, though the bruises still lingered. They stood silent, waiting for me to choose. I stepped aside. For a long moment, none of them moved. Then the younger ones walked in single file, quiet as shadows. The eldest was last. She held my eyes, her voice calm when she said, "You got room for 6?" I glanced around the cabin, at the small table, the pot simmering on. The stove, the fire crackling low. My throat felt tight, but I managed. I'll make do. She nodded once and stepped inside. I shut the door behind her, and for the first time in years, the cabin wasn't empty. It wasn't loud either, but the silence had shifted. We ate together that night. Not many words, not much laughter, but the food passed from hand to hand, and the fire stayed warm. Nobody asked when they'd be leaving, and sitting there, with 5 strangers who no longer felt like strangers, I realized something I hadn't in a long time. Maybe this land still had room for people who'd lost everything if they were willing to stay. And maybe, just maybe, I was ready to stay too. It was near dusk the first time she really spoke to me, not just the sharp question about running them off, but words that carried weight, the kind you could feel settle in your chest long after they were said. I'd been working on the fence all day, hammering nails into warped rails, the kind of slow, steady work that keeps a man's hands busy and his mind quiet. The sun was dropping low, painting the mesa in long strokes of red and shadow, when I felt her presence before I saw her. Ayana. That was her name, though I didn't know it yet. She stood a few paces back, silent, her shadow stretching long across the dirt. I didn't turn at once. Years of habit had taught me that people reveal more in the space between silence than in what they rushed to say. I drove another nail, set the hammer aside, and only then looked over. She was watching me, her arms crossed tight over her chest, a length of cloth wrapped around one arm like she'd bound it herself. Bruises still marked her face, darker now with healing, but her eyes were steady. "We'll work," she said, voice low but firm. I straightened slowly, rubbing my palms against my pants. My back ached from bending, but I tried not to show it. "I know," I answered. She didn't move. Her gaze stayed locked on me, sharp as a hawk's. "You're wondering if we'll leave," she said after a beat. I held her eyes, not denying it. "You planning to?" "Not unless we have to." Her words carried more than defiance. They carried a promise, a vow tucked into the bones of her voice. I studied her then, not as a stranger in my yard, but as a woman who had already carried more than her share of weight. The way she stood, shoulders back despite the bruises, told me she was used to deciding for others, not just herself. "What's your name?" I asked. "Ayana." I gave a small nod. "Flint." Her expression didn't change, but there was a flicker in her eyes, like maybe she already knew. Maybe she'd seen my name burned into the saddle of that old mare, too stubborn to die. Or maybe she just understood that names weren't gifts here. They were burdens we carried, and sharing them was a kind of trust. She stepped forward then, slow, not enough to close the distance, just enough to run her fingers along the top of the fence. Rail. Her hands were rough, scraped, the kind that had worked, not just been held. She said, "We'll stay out of your way." I shook my head, surprised by the sudden heaviness in my throat. "Don't want that." Her eyes narrowed, not suspicious, just puzzled. "Why?" I leaned against the fence, felt the rough wood press into my back. The words came before I had time to dress them up. "This place is too quiet on its own." She studied me for a long moment, and in that silence I felt more exposed than I had in years. Not because she judged me, but because she didn't. She just stood there, seeing me the way the wind sees a canyon, taking in every scar, every hollow without flinching. Finally, She nodded once and turned back toward the barn. I watched her go, the braid of her hair loose down her back, her steps steady despite the limp she carried in one leg, and something in me eased, like a knot I'd been holding, without knowing it had loosened just a little. That night, we shared stew again. The 5 of them filed into the cabin, each one settling in the same place they'd taken before, quiet, deliberate, like they were drawing invisible boundaries around themselves. Ayana sat across from me, her face in the firelight, eyes lowered but sharp enough to lift whenever mine wandered too long. We didn't speak much, none of us did, but the air felt different than it had the first nights, less like strangers circling each other, more like people who understood they weren't leaving tomorrow. Later, when the others had gone back to the barn to sleep, she lingered by the fire. I sat in my chair, whittling the edge of an old piece of wood just to keep my hands moving, and she stood with her arms crossed again, watching the flames. "You don't ask much," she said finally. I glanced up. "Would you answer if I did?" Her mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "Maybe. Depends on the question." I set the wood aside, leaned forward with my elbows on my knees. "You the oldest?" "Yeah." "You pulled them out yourself?" Her jaw tightened, her eyes flicked toward the door where the younger ones had gone. "I did." I didn't ask how. I didn't need to. The look in her eyes told me it hadn't been clean or simple. It had cost her something deep, maybe everything she had left. She took a breath, her voice dropping lower. "They were going to be split up, traded one at a time. I couldn't let that happen." Her gaze cut to mine, sharp enough to pin me in place. "I had to get them out." I felt my hand tighten against my knee, my jaw clench hard enough it ached. The war had shown me plenty of cruelty, but hearing it plain like that, in her voice, brought the anger up in me like a fire I'd thought long dead. "You ain't like most," she said after a moment, softer now. "Not anymore," I answered. She studied me once more, then turned toward the door. As she opened it, the wind carried in a breath of cold, rattling the lantern flame. She stepped out without another word, but the silence she left behind wasn't the same as before. It was heavier, deeper, filled with things we hadn't said but both understood. I sat there long after she was gone, staring at the fire, feeling something shift inside me. Trust, maybe, or the start of it. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the quiet was closing in around me. I felt like it was making room. It didn't happen all at once. Life never does. It shifts in small ways, like the slow turn of a season, and you don't realize the change has taken root until you look back and can't remember how it felt before. That's how it was with the 5 women in my home. One day it was just me, my tools, and the silence. Then, without planning, without talk, we had a rhythm. In the mornings, I used to be the one to stir the fire, shuffle to the stove, and get the kettle going. Now, some days, I'd step out of my room and find the flames already alive, a pot of water steaming gentle on the iron, the smell of sage lingering in the air. No one said who had done it, but I'd catch Wren's small figure by the hearth, her hands busy with cloth scraps, pretending she hadn't been the one. I didn't call her on it. I just poured my cup, nodded once in her direction, and that was enough. The land started to feel different too. Sunny, quiet, soft-footed, took to the far patch near the fence line. At first I thought she was just wandering, but then I noticed small lines in the dirt, rows drawn with care, little mounds of seed tucked under. Wildflowers at first, then beans, corn, herbs. She never asked permission, she just planted, and I never stopped her. I'd long believed the soil was too dry to hold much of anything, but each evening I saw her carrying dishwater out to sprinkle the rows, shielding the fragile green shoots with small stones to keep the wind from tearing them away. That kind of quiet determination, it humbles a man. Tula, the smallest, was always barefoot, her toes black with dust, her hands quick as birds. She found the broken things before I did, hinges, latches, cracked mugs. One afternoon I came back from hauling water to find her crouched by the tool shed door, hammering a nail with a flat stone. I opened my mouth to scold her, then stopped when I saw the hinge straightened, the door swinging clean on its frame. She didn't grin, didn't look for praise. She just wiped her hands on her skirt and moved on to the next task. I left an old pair of moccasins by the hearth for her that night, but she ignored them. Some people's roots go deeper in the earth than shoes can handle. Mika had a way about her that reminded me of soldiers I'd known. Practical, steady, sharp-eyed. Even with one arm still bound from a break that hadn't healed right, she took charge of the livestock. The chickens were fed before dawn, the old mare brushed and watered, the wire around the coop patched with care. She moved fast, silent, like her hands didn't have time to waste. I'd see her eyes drift toward the horizon more often than not, always watching for something I couldn't see. She was carrying a weight that made her older than her years, and though I never asked, I respected it. Wren stayed close to the cabin. She was the youngest, her small hands always busy with scraps of cloth and twine. One morning, I found a rough little doll sitting on the table, stitched unevenly but with care. She never claimed it, but I knew. She hummed sometimes, low and tuneless, the kind of sound that clung to the walls long after it stopped. That sound, as small as it was, filled the cabin in ways my silence never could. And then there was Ayanna. She didn't hover, she didn't explain herself, but she walked the fence line same as I did, not beside me, not behind me, just near enough that our boots crunched the dirt in rhythm. She carried rope slung over her shoulder like a habit she couldn't let go of. Her eyes scanned the horizon more than the ground, and she spoke only when needed. I'd gotten used to silence being empty, but with her, silence felt solid, like standing next to a post driven deep into the earth. We rarely spoke of the past, theirs or mine, but sometimes, as dusk painted the cliffs, the cabin filled with the smell of stew and bread, and the five of them gathered around the table, I'd catch Ayanna watching me with an expression I couldn't name. Not suspicion, not softness, but something in between, like she was measuring me against all the men who had failed her before. I didn't try to meet it with words. I just passed the pot, broke bread, kept the fire strong. Trust doesn't come from promises, it comes from presence. Each of them moved with independence, yet together. They didn't cling to me, didn't wait to be told, didn't act like rescued women. They acted like survivors, still unsure what safety meant, but unwilling to let their hands rest idle. And me, I went from a man filling his days with chores to a man noticing the difference between doing work alone and doing work with others nearby. The fence got mended faster. The barn creaked less, the kitchen smelled more like food and less like smoke. One evening, after a long day of labor, I dragged an old bench from the barn and set it on the porch beside mine. I didn't say why, I just placed it there. By the time the stars came out, Sunny was sitting on it, her head tilted to the sky, a sprig of dried flower twined between her fingers. The others came and went, some inside, some lingering near the fire pit, but that bench wasn't empty again. It was in those small, wordless moments I realized something was happening. The ranch wasn't just mine anymore. The silence that once weighed on me like a stone was changing shape. It wasn't heavy, it was shared. And when silence is shared, it doesn't crush you, it holds you up. It was late afternoon when Ayanna finally told me the truth of what had driven them here. The sun was slipping down the mesa, the cliffs catching fire in red and gold, and I was working on the tool shed latch, tightening a hinge that had come loose. I didn't hear her footsteps, but I saw her shadow stretch across the dirt before I looked up. She was standing a few feet away, arms folded across her chest, her face calm, but her eyes holding that sharpness I'd come to expect. "You don't ask much," she said. I kept my hand on the wrench, testing the bolt. "Would you answer if I did?" "Depends on the question." I wiped the sweat from my forehead with the back of my sleeve and leaned against the shed. "Then tell me this. What were you running from?" Her jaw tightened. She didn't answer right away. I could see her weighing whether I was worth the words. Finally, she looked past me toward the barn, where Wren's small figure was perched on the porch rail, humming soft to herself. Ayanna's voice came low and steady. "We were taken." I felt my chest go still, my breath heavy in my throat. "Traitors," she said. "Some white men. Some half-drunk traitors who know no one will stop them. One used to work with the cavalry near Fort Ellison. They think Apache girls ain't human, just something to pass around and toss aside. Her voice never shook, but her hands did. She hid it by crossing her arms tighter, pressing her fingers into her sleeves. My jaw clenched so hard I felt my teeth ache. I had seen men at their worst during the war, had watched cruelty strip all meaning out of life, but hearing it spoken plain like that, it stoked a fire in me I thought had gone cold years ago. I forced myself to meet her eyes. "You pulled them out yourself?" She nodded once, short and sharp. "They were going to split us up, traded one at a time. I couldn't let that happen." Her gaze hardened as if daring me to flinch away. "You ever see a girl dragged by her braids from a wagon while men laughed?" I swallowed, slow. "Yeah," I said, "I have." "Then you know why we're not going back." I didn't look away. "I wouldn't let you." Something in her eased then, just a fraction. Her shoulders dropped, her jaw loosened. She studied me like she was searching for the catch, the lie, the weakness. Finding none, she gave the smallest nod, then stepped back toward the barn. The last of the sun caught her braid, turned it to fire before she disappeared inside. I stood there long after she was gone, my fists tight at my sides. The shed door creaked as I closed it, and instead of heading back to the cabin, I walked to the old storage shed behind the barn. I hadn't opened it in years. Dust lay thick across the boards, cobwebs in the corners. Inside, under a heap of tarps and wood scraps, were the things I'd kept but never touched. Remnants from the war, relics from the fire, pieces of a life I'd tried to bury. I pulled out an oilcloth bundle, heavy with rust and memory, a rifle. I laid it across the workbench, unwrapped it, and stared at the corroded barrel, the pitted stock. My fingers traced the grooves, remembering nights when this gun had been the only thing between me and death. I'd sworn to leave it there, forgotten. But now I couldn't. I worked it clean until my fingers ached, until the oil ran black and the metal gleamed again. Then I found another, smaller, just as rusted, and I cleaned that one too. By the time I was done, my shoulders burned and the sun had long set, but the rifles lay ready, oiled and loaded, leaning by the door of my cabin. The next morning, I didn't mention them. I just left them where they could be seen. Mika was the first to notice. She paused near the door, her eyes flicking to the rifles, then to me. She didn't ask. She only nodded once, the kind of nod that said she understood exactly why they were there. Later, I saw Ayana glance at them too. She didn't say anything either, but when our eyes met across the room, something passed between us. Not gratitude, not relief, something stronger. Agreement. That evening, while I shoveled grain into the trough, Sunny came to stand beside me. She didn't look at me, didn't fidget with her hands like she sometimes did. She just asked, plain, "You think they'll come?" I set the shovel down slow, leaned on the handle. "If they do, it won't be for kindness." She nodded, her face steady. "Then we'll be ready." There was no panic in her voice, no tremor, just fact, like she had already accepted that staying meant fighting, and fighting meant survival. That night, the air on the porch felt different. The stars came out clear, the mesa stretched dark and wide, but the silence wasn't fragile, it was strong. Ayana sat on the top step, sharpening a blade against a stone. Mika crouched nearby, a stick in her good hand, shaping it to a point. Sunny knelt by the fence, watching the horizon. Tula carried a bucket, her bare feet soundless against the dirt. Wren stayed inside, humming low, her doll clutched to her chest. I stood in the doorway, watching them, and it struck me then. They weren't waiting for someone to protect them. They had saved themselves before I ever opened that barn door. All I had done was leave the door open. But that door mattered. It meant we were here now, all of us, and if danger came, it wouldn't find us alone. That night, when the fire inside burned low, I sat with the rifles across my knees. I thought of Ayana's voice, calm and steady as she told me the truth. I thought of the bruises still fading on their skin, the scars that would never fade. I thought of the men out there who had taken what they wanted and thought they could keep doing it without consequence. And I knew in my bones that if they came again, I'd meet them at the door. Not because I'd chosen to fight, but because I'd chosen to stay. It was the kind of morning where the sky carried no sound, no wind, no birds, not even the distant groan of the mesa. Just stillness, heavy and unnatural. I woke before the light, not because of the cold or the ache in my side, but because something inside me braced, like my body knew before my eyes did. When I stepped out onto the porch, the land looked the same as always, dry earth cracked with lines, cliffs painted gray in the dawn, but Ayanna was already there, standing near the barn with her arms folded tight, her hair loose down her back. I knew by the rigid line of her shoulders that something wasn't right. "Something wrong?" I asked, my voice low. She didn't turn at first. Her eyes were fixed on the ground at her feet, where the dirt told its story clearer than words ever could. "Horse prints," she said finally. "Fresh, coming from the ridge." I walked to her side, crouched, and pressed my fingers into the soil. The edges of the prints were sharp, not weathered by wind, the dirt inside still cool but unsettled. I traced the shape of the hooves, not ranch horses. Narrower, sharper, pressed in with weight that told me the riders weren't just passing through. They were scouting, hunting. "More than one," Ayanna said. "2, maybe 3. I stood slow, brushed the dirt from my hands, and looked out toward the horizon. The ridge was quiet, shrouded in a thin gray mist. Nothing moved, but that was what worried me most. "You tell the others?" I asked. She shook her head. "Didn't want to scare them." Then her eyes turned to me, sharp as flint striking stone. "But they'll need to know." I nodded. "They'll come quiet if it's them." Her jaw tightened. "Then we stay louder." Those words stayed with me. They didn't run, didn't talk about leaving. Instead, after breakfast, Ayanna told the others what she'd seen. The fire crackled low, the chipped mugs of coffee steaming in our hands, and her voice was clear. "Tracks. 2, maybe 3 men. Could be close." There was no panic, no wide eyes, no tears, just silence heavy enough to fill the room. Then one by one, they answered without words. Tula stood and walked to the barn, gathering old boards and iron rods. Mika pulled a length of wire from a tin and started stringing it along the gate. Sunny went out to the garden and began carefully digging up her seedlings, moving them into small clay pots she made from scraps. "They'll need water if something happens," she murmured, her hands trembling but steady all the same. Wren, silent as ever, set her cloth aside and stood near Mika. Her chin lifted as if to say she wasn't hiding this time. I watched it unfold, feeling something shift deep in my chest. These weren't women waiting to be saved. They were preparing, same as me. Every movement they made said the same thing. We won't be taken again. By noon, the place had changed. Tula had boarded up the side window of the barn, her small hands covered in splinters but relentless. Mika had set a line of broken glass and horseshoe nails under the back window, a makeshift alarm. Sunny carried water buckets from the well until her shoulders shook, filling every barrel and trough. Wren hummed as she stitched cloth into long strips, her lips pressed tight, but her voice carrying through the cabin. It wasn't a tune I knew, but it steadied the air. I walked the perimeter more times than I could count, boots kicking dust, eyes scanning the ridge. Each time I returned, something new had been done. A pile of kindling stacked by the porch, curtains drawn tight, blades sharpened by the fire pit. The air was different, charged, but not with fear, with purpose. That evening, as the sun dipped low, they gathered outside near the fire pit for the first time since they'd come. Ayanna sat on the step, her rifle across her knees, running a cloth down the barrel. Mika sat nearby, whittling a stick into a spear. Sunny stacked small stones in neat piles, her hands quick and precise. Tula crouched low, her knife in her lap, eyes on the horizon. Wren traced shapes in the dirt with a stick, silent but present. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, watching them. They didn't look to me for orders, didn't ask me what to do. They already knew. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't before. They weren't my burden. They weren't strays I'd taken in. They were warriors in their own right, each one carrying a strength the world had tried to break. All I had done was open the door, but that door had changed everything. As night settled, the mesa dark and wide under the stars, Ayana came to sit beside me on the porch. She didn't look at me when she spoke. "Why'd you let us stay?" I let the question hang there, staring at the land, the cliffs etched against the moonlight. I thought about the years of silence, the long stretch of days when I convinced myself I didn't need anyone. I thought about the night I opened the barn and saw 5 pairs of eyes staring back at me, not with hope, not with fear, but with the emptiness of people who had been let down too many times. "Because I know what it feels like," I said finally, "to have no one come." She turned then, studying me with those dark eyes that always seemed to cut deeper than words. "And I don't want to be that man anymore." For a long time, she said nothing. Then she reached down, picked up the second rifle I'd leaned against the bench, and rested it across her lap. She nodded once, not to me, but to the land itself, like she was making a vow. Together we sat there, the rifles between us, the women moving behind us in the glow of the firelight. We didn't wait with fear, we waited with purpose. And I knew then that if those riders came, they wouldn't find us broken. They'd find us standing side by side. The night before they came, I barely slept. I sat on the porch with my rifle across my knees, listening to the silence press in from every side. The wind had died, the stars were sharp above the mesa, and still I felt it, the waiting, the weight of something coming closer. Ayana sat beside me, her own rifle laid across her lap, her face calm but her eyes fixed on the horizon. Neither of us spoke much. Words felt too small against what we both knew was on its way. Just before dawn, I heard it. Hooves crunching over hard dirt, steady, measured, too deliberate to be travelers passing through. My hand tightened on the rifle, but I didn't rise until the sound reached the yard. 3 men rode in, shadows against the pale gray of morning. One dismounted, his boots thudding against the earth as he strode up to the porch. He banged a fist against the door. "You in there, old man?" His voice was rough, too sure of itself, the way men sound when they think nothing can stop them. "We're looking for something that came through here. A few girls, Apache. Might have passed this way." I stayed still for a breath, feeling the wood of the rifle stock warm under my palms. Then I stood and opened the door. The man on the porch was broad-shouldered, unshaven, his eyes bloodshot from a life that had left little room for decency. Behind him, one younger rider twitched with nervous energy, his hand never far from the revolver at his side. The third, thick-necked, had a shotgun slung across his back and a smirk that made my stomach turn. "Ain't seen anyone," I said, voice low. The leader narrowed his eyes. "Liar. We tracked them here. Days on their trail. One of them smashed my cousin's hand with a rock. You know how that feels, old man? To wake up and find bones sticking through your skin?" I didn't flinch. "They're not yours to find." He took a step closer, his breath hot with whiskey. "That's a lot of talk for one man." I lifted the rifle, steady, not pointing yet, but enough to make his smirk falter. "That's your last warning." The cabin door creaked behind me. Ayana stepped out, rifle raised. Then Mika appeared, her jaw tight, a knife strapped to her side. Sunny followed, her hands steady on the barrel of the old shotgun. Even Tula, barefoot and fierce, stood in the doorway with her knife glinting in the pale light. The men went still. The smirk faded. The leader's eyes darted between them and me, disbelief breaking into something harder. "You'd kill over them?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "No," I said. "I'd kill for what's right. They just happen to be part of that." For a long moment, no one moved. The air itself held its breath. Then the leader spat into the dirt, backing up one slow step. His hand twitched near his coat, but he didn't draw. "You'll regret this," he muttered. I leveled the rifle higher, my finger brushing the trigger. "No," I said. "I won't." He gave one last glare, then turned. The other 2 mounted quick, their horses restless beneath them. Dust rose in the gray light as they rode off, their shapes shrinking against the horizon until they were nothing but shadows swallowed by the land. I stood there until the sound of hooves faded, my chest tight, the ache in my jaw telling me I'd been clenching it too long. Behind me, Ayana didn't lower her rifle until the riders disappeared completely. Only then did she step back inside. The others followed, their shoulders still rigid, their eyes sharp as if waiting for the men to circle back. That's when I felt small hands grip my coat. Wren. She had slipped out while no one noticed, her doll clutched in one arm, her fists tight in my jacket with the other. She didn't speak, just held on. I knelt, set the rifle down, and laid my hand on her back. My voice came rough, softer than I meant. It's all right now. But even as I said it, I knew all right was a fragile word. Those men weren't gone from the world. They'd be out there still, carrying their anger, maybe gathering more. Yet we had stood, and for now, that was enough. Inside the cabin, the women moved quietly, checking latches, pulling curtains tight. Sunny's hands shook as she poured water into a cup. Mika's knuckles were white around the knife she refused to set down. Tula sat against the wall, staring at the door, her chest rising and falling too fast. Ayana leaned her rifle against the table and rubbed a hand across her face. For the first time since I'd known her, her shoulders sagged. She looked at me across the firelight. They'll be back. I nodded. I know. They might bring more. I know that too. Her eyes searched mine, looking for weakness, maybe fear. Do you regret it? I stared into the flames, then back at her. I've made plenty of choices I regret. This ain't one of them. Her lips pressed tight, and she gave the smallest nod. Neither is staying. The room went quiet again, but it wasn't the same silence as before. It wasn't the silence of fear or emptiness. It was the silence of people who had faced something together and were still breathing. It was the silence of belonging. That night, when the fire burned low and the land outside lay heavy with darkness, I sat on the porch alone. The rifle rested across my knees, the wood warm against my palms. I thought about those men, the hatred in their eyes, the certainty that the world owed them whatever they wanted. And then I thought about the women behind me, their strength, their defiance, their choice to stand. I realized then that this place was no longer mine alone. It was ours, and no one was going to take it from us without a fight. The first snow had just dusted the ridge when I realized I no longer thought of the 5 women as guests under my roof, nor as burdens I had taken in out of pity. They were part of me now, as much as the barn I mended or the land I worked with my hands. I remember standing on the porch that morning, the world hushed beneath white, and watching Ahyoka scatter feed for the chickens, her breath rising in soft clouds. She bent low, her hands gentle, her hair falling forward, and for a moment I thought of my late wife, though the thought carried no ache this time, just a recognition that life had circled back in some unexpected, tender, snapped way. I whispered to myself, "This is home again," and the words startled me because I hadn't dared think that since before the fire that nearly hollowed me out. Inside, the others were stirring. Nalin was kneading dough, her strong arms steady, her face serene in the lamplight. She had taken to the kitchen like she'd been born in it, turning simple flour and water into meals that smelled of belonging. Across the room, DeSoto was sewing patches into my work shirt. She glanced up and caught me looking. "You tear these on purpose, Flint," she teased, though her smile softened the words. I grinned, rubbing the back of my neck. "I reckon a man has to find ways to keep your hands busy," I answered, and her laughter warmed the rafters. The younger ones, Tyanita and Waya, were perched by the hearth, one weaving strips of cloth, the other sketching patterns in the ashes with a stick. They were quiet still, but not in the way of fear. It was the quiet of girls who had begun to trust the stillness, who no longer flinched at every creak of the wind. I found myself crouching beside them, tracing my own finger across the soot. "That's a horse," Waya said shyly, pointing at her design. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Best-looking horse I ever saw," I told her, and she beamed, a smile like dawn breaking through. It hit me then, hard and deep, How far we had all come since the night I found them huddled in my barn, bruised and barefoot. Back then, they were shadows, trembling, unsure if they were safe, even with a man who offered no harm. And well, I was no better, living in a shell, speaking to no one but the cattle, drifting like dust without roots. We had been ghosts, all of us, and somehow we'd built flesh and warmth out of ashes. One evening, as the wind howled against the shutters, Ayoka sat across from me, her gaze steady. "You gave us back breath, Flint," she said, her words quiet but unshakable. I shook my head, the old habit of denial rising fast. "No," I murmured, "you gave me back mine." Her eyes softened then, and though no more was said, the silence between us was filled with a knowing that didn't need words. Nights grew longer, and I found myself lingering by the fire after they all drifted to sleep. I'd watch the glow on their faces, see their chests rise and fall, and feel a strange kind of peace settle in me. The ranch, once hollow with echoes, now pulsed with life. Boots by the door, laughter stitched into the walls, the scent of bread, the clatter of wood on wood, the hum of voices singing soft songs I didn't understand, but felt in my bones. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes, and thought, this is what I didn't know I was waiting for. Of course, the world didn't stop testing us. Word spread in Cold Mesa about the women on my land. Some tongues wagged, some men spat, and a few hinted at coming to take what they thought didn't belong to me. But each time I looked at the women, saw their backs straighten and their eyes hold steady, I knew we weren't fragile. "Let them talk," I muttered more than once, tightening the straps on my saddle. "This is ours, and no man alive will strip it away again." The truth is, I began to see myself not just as their protector, but as theirs, belonging to them as much as they to me. They didn't need saving anymore. They needed someone to walk beside them, and somehow, by grace or luck, that someone was me. One night, when the stars cut sharp above the mesa, I stepped outside and found Tayanita sitting on the porch steps, wrapped in a quilt. She glanced up at me, her eyes shining in the starlight. "We're not afraid anymore," she whispered. I sank down beside her, my chest tight with a swell I couldn't name. "Good," I said softly, my voice catching. "Neither am I." And I meant it. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of tomorrow, of loss, of waking to emptiness. I wasn't afraid of loving what I could lose. I had already lost everything once, and yet here I was, given the impossible gift of starting over. As the snow deepened and the days shortened, I knew something sure and steady in my bones. This was no longer just my ranch, my story, or my life. It was ours. And no matter what came, no matter what storms or men or whispers in town tried to press against us, we would stand, because we had already been broken and we had already been remade, together. I leaned against the porch post, breathed the cold air deep, and let my heart speak words I'd never dared before. This is my family. And with those words, the night didn't feel cold at all. I'll carry these words slow, like the way dusk lays its colors over Cold Mesa, gentle, certain, and lasting. Life has a way of slipping past a man without warning. You blink, and the years scatter like dry leaves in the wind, carrying pieces of you with them. For a long time, I thought my days would pass that way, quiet, lonesome, no mark left behind except a weathered ranch, half-finished fences, and a man too stubborn to lay down. Then one night, I opened a barn door and found 5 bruised, barefoot Apache women trembling in the straw. That moment split my life in two, the years before and the years after. And I reckon I'll never stop being grateful for the after. I didn't set out to be anyone's savior. Truth is, they saved me more than I could ever claim to have saved them. I was a man running on habit, waking with the sun, mending what I could, watching the world shrink smaller each season. The silence in the house had gotten too thick, like a fog I couldn't walk through. When they came into my life, it wasn't with words or declarations, but with their presence, their labor, their trust inching toward me one careful step at a time. Every nail driven, every fire built, every meal shared, it stitched a torn part of me back together. Sometimes I sit on the porch in the evenings and watch them, the way laughter spills out when they tease each other while hauling water, the way their voices rise like music when they sing around the hearth, the way they carry the weight of grief without letting it drown them. I wonder if they know how much they've given me. I hope they do, and I pray they know they'll never have to run again, not as long as I draw breath. There were days I questioned myself whether I was strong enough to stand between them and the shadows that still lurked. Men who thought women could be bought, traded, or used. I've seen that kind before. I fought them before too, and I'll do it again without hesitation. But I learned something watching those women. They don't need a man to make them whole. They were already strong, already fierce, already surviving when the world had tried to break them. All I did was open a door, and in return, they opened my life. I think about love in ways I never did before, not the kind written in dime novels or whispered in town parlors. Love here is in the calloused hands passing me a cup of water after a long day, in the quiet nods across the supper table, in the trust of sleeping beneath the same roof without fear. It's in the way they lay down their burdens slowly, one by one, until their shoulders don't look so heavy. And I find myself laying mine down too. One night, Mara asked me, "Flint, do you ever wish for the way things were before?" I had to think on it, but the truth came out plain. "No," I told her, "because before was just waiting and now is living." She smiled at me then, a soft smile that carried both sorrow and hope, and I reckon it'll stay with me till my last day. Lessons come harder the older you get, but they still come if you're willing. I've learned that a man isn't measured by the acres he owns or the fences he mends, but by the lives he makes room for. I've learned that silence can be heavy as a coffin or light as a quilt, depending on who shares it with you. And I've learned that family isn't just blood, it's choice, it's staying, it's building together, even when the world says you don't belong. So when I sit out back, the fire low, stars stretched wide across the mesa, I whisper, "Thanks. Thanks for the women who walked barefoot into my barn and never walked back out again, at least not alone. Thanks for the chance to learn that healing ain't a finish line, but a road you walk together, some days stumbling, some days strong. And thanks that I won't be leaving this world the way I thought I would, empty." If you've walked with me through this story, maybe you've felt some of it in your own bones. Maybe you've known loneliness that felt like it would never end. Maybe you've been given a gift you didn't think you deserved. If so, I hope you see the same truth I did. No one's too far gone to find home again. Not me, not them, not you. If these words touched you, I'd ask you to help me keep them alive. Like this video, leave a comment down below, share what this story stirred in you, and follow the channel so more folks can find these true-hearted tales. Every voice matters, every story carries weight, and your presence here tells me these lessons won't be forgotten. I'll leave you with this. Take care of those who stumble into your life. Don't measure them by what they've lost, but by what they carry still. And don't be afraid to let them carry you too. Because sometimes the family you never expected is the one that saves you in the end. That's what happened to me. I'm Flint McAllen, and this is the life I never thought I'd have, built not on fences or cattle, but on trust, healing, and the unshakable truth that love, quiet, steadfast love, was waiting for me all along.